In 1995, excavation began on what would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries ever. Klaus Schmidt uncovered ancient ruins that predated known civilization. What does this discovery mean for the known history of mankind? Was it built by a lost civilization? Or perhaps hunter-gatherers? Maybe aliens? Let's find out in episode 3, Gobekli Tepe.
It's the Alien Conspiracy Podcast. We are your hosts, Agent Anderson
and Agent ETA.
All right, come along as we examine UFO sightings, conspiracies, and all things strange. Follow the show on Twitter at AlienConPod. But first, it's time for Strange Events, Bizarre Facts, the Unbelievable Revealed. This is the Mind Boggle of the Week. Gigantopithecus. Is Bigfoot real? No one knows for sure, but archaeologists found evidence of a large primate that went extinct 100,000 years ago. Up to 10 feet tall and weighing as much as 1,300 pounds, Gigantopithecus is the largest known primate to ever walk the earth. Remains have been found in India, China, and Indonesia. This massive beast lived alongside Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years. What would it be like to stand face to face with one of these creatures? Would they make good roommates? Is it possible that their descendant is responsible for Bigfoot sightings? Probably not, but still, it boggles the mind. And now, time for the show.
All right. There really isn't a conspiracy here or anything like that. You know, it's more of just an amazing find, an amazing archaeological site that pretty much flips what we knew about history, or what we accept about human history, completely on its rear end. It completely, changes the timelines that we had set up. We thought that civilized human history was about 6,000 years old, but now it seems like it's easily, 11,600, around there. At the end of the Younger Dryas era is when this place was supposed to have been filled in all at once.
Where is the place?
Well, the site's located in southeast Turkey. It's in the Anatolia region. So the site was originally found in the 1960s, but the tops of the pillars, the T-shaped pillars that are located there, were the only parts that were of the architecture that was sticking out of the ground. So the people that originally found it thought that it might have been just tops of grave markers. So they didn't recognize it as architecture as such, and they, for that reason, they kind of just glanced by it because it wasn't exactly what they thought they were looking for. 1994, Klaus Schmidt actually visited the site, and he knew right away, once he was looking at what the tops of these pillars, these weren't grave markers, not in his estimation. So he decided to take a chance on it. Let's see. There's a quote from Klaus Schmidt where he says, "Within a minute of first seeing it, I knew I had two choices: go away and tell nobody, or spend the rest of my life working here." And I think that kind of shows part of his insight. That Klaus Schmidt must have been a very intelligent person, because as soon as he saw the site, he knew that there was a great amount of importance there. And I'm sure it probably hit him like a ton of bricks too, once he realized that these aren't grave markers; this is architecture.
Yeah,
it's not supposed to be here either.
That was the craziest thing. Well, not the craziest, but that was a weird thing. Is other archaeologists had seen the site, but none of them recognized it for what it was. But apparently, just the way it was kind of built up, that Schmidt knew right away. It was just kind of strange. Smart guy, I bet.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. And one of the amazing things about the site is through carbon dating of the fill material that's been found there. It appears that this is the oldest known site of human construction that we've ever found. Excluding possible sites that have been misdated, of course, because, there's a whole nother conversation there that we can start, and that's a whole nother podcast, misdated sites and the potential of those, The sites, I'm sure there's plenty in Europe and Northern Africa in particular, and the Middle East, that could quite possibly be a dramatic amount older than we think they are, and could also be, I think there's a lot of potential of sites being built upon over and over throughout the millennia. Romans in particular were known for being very efficient individuals, especially when it comes to architecture. I think that it's quite possible you have places like the Temple of Jupiter that have these foundation bricks that are foundation structures that are so much larger. The building materials are so much larger than what you would think they would need to use. I think it's quite likely that they found ruins that were still intact enough to where they could use the foundations of it, or even some still building materials that may have been strewn around the site, maybe even. But yeah, Gobekli Tepe means the belly hill. It's been known about. There's a couple different sites. There's a lot of different pot-bellied hills or hills of the navel in the area. And there's
oh yeah, there are other sites. I didn't actually look into those too much because it's just a big rabbit hole. I didn't have time for it all. But there are other sites similar to Gobekli Tepe that they haven't really uncovered yet, but they're starting to research a little bit. From what I read, which hopefully they uncover something that reveals a little more about like all the artwork and stuff is really intricate. And nobody knows what any of it means. I mean, we'll get into that a little bit later, what some possible interpretations of the artwork there, but it's all just guessing, basically.
Yeah.
So this basically, the site of Gobekli Tepe has over 20 circular formations, and each formation is a circle of pillars with two big pillars in the middle. There's more than 200 pillars altogether. Each formation is about up to 100 feet in diameter. And some of them they'll have stone benches on the interior. The entire site is over 22 acres. Not all of it's been excavated. In fact, just from what I could tell, less than 5% of the total site has been excavated. But everything else they know about by using ground penetrating radar and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, only 5% of it has been excavated, but like you said, they do know about a substantial amount more because of that ground penetrating radar. This site is I mean, like what you just said, 22 acres. That's massive. That's a gigantic site. It dwarfs something like Stonehenge. And, that's one of those megalithic sites that most people are going to recognize when you mention it just by name, Stonehenge. They have that image probably locked in their brains, most people that have seen it at least, because we've been exposed to it so many times throughout our childhood and adult, years that how could you not know that image, So I think that's a very proper megalithic site to compare it to, just because it's well known.
Yeah, and the thing about Stonehenge is that it's so worn away that maybe it had artwork on it at some point, but it's just worn off over the years. I don't know, maybe it didn't, but the artwork at Gobekli Tepe is it's really amazing for any time, let alone the time it was built.
Well, and it's also it states a level of sophistication too, because it's not images that are carved into the pillar; it's reliefs carved out of the stone. Right. So it takes a little bit more mental process to do something like that, as opposed to just carving something into a stone.
Yeah, it's the bas relief, I think, is the technical term, and so they take material away. So instead of just carving something into the stone, they have to take away like 90% of the material to get the pictures to come out of the stone. And it gives it a completely different look, and it's like super hard to do, and it
takes a lot
rare.
of planning.
Yeah, there's really not that many examples of it early on, and definitely not this early on, because it's so much harder to do than carving into the stone that probably people, even if they thought of doing it, decided it was too much work. The pillars themselves they're made out of limestone, and they're as big as 16 feet tall and 50 tons. And some of them have caps on top as big as 10 tons. The central pillars are T-shaped. Those are the ones that have the blocks on top, the 10-ton caps.
And it's pretty amazing too, because you have a 10-ton cap. Imagine how, with a T-shaped pillar, imagine how top-heavy that must be.
Yeah.
And supposedly, I mean, from one of the images and some of the articles I've read about this as well, it seems like these T-shaped pillars are seated right on top of the bedrock, and they're seated within these like pedestals that are kind of carved out of the bedrock, but they're not married directly to it. It's not like they're part of the same stone. These T-shaped pillars, they were quarried from a different spot. It wasn't really far away, but I think the quarry was about 300 or 1,500 feet away from the actual site. So it's not like they had a gigantic amount of ground to cover when moving these stones. But still,
It's far enough.
when you're, but yeah, absolutely, yeah, right. For hunter gatherers too, I mean, could it be done? Yeah, sure, absolutely. But you have to have that free time as well. You know, you have to have, stocks of food and stuff to create free time, right?
Well, one of the strangest details to me is that and I had to look this up because I didn't know what it meant, but some of the circles had terrazzo floors, and terrazzo is basically like a concrete where they mix a couple different materials. The most well-known example is like the Hollywood Walk of Fame. You know how it gets a like spotted look, but like that's cavemen didn't mix concrete, so it's very strange. This doesn't make any sense to me that cavemen built this thing.
Yeah, I know that Schmidt believed that they had used flint tools to cut and carve the massive stones. It's possible, you know. I'm not going to sit here and claim that I know everything about it. That's for dang sure, but I think that logic needs to be used. And if they're if they're carving reliefs away from these pillars, I think flint tools is probably a little bit below them. At the very least, I think they're capable of more sophistication than that, you know.
Well, what I'd like to see is some archaeologists grab themselves some flint tools and carve a replica that's maybe 5 feet tall, and just see how easy it would be to do.
Yeah. Well, hey, it might really surprise us how easy it is. Maybe we're giving them too much credit, you know. I don't
That's
think
the
so.
thing.
But
That's the thing. Sometimes they do these experiments, and you find out, oh, okay, well, this is how they did it, and it's actually not that hard as hard as you think it is.
Mm-hmm. And also, you never know if we're just going about it the complete wrong way. Are we even asking the right question? You know what I mean? As far as how did they go about doing it? You know, because there's a lot of even simple technologies, I'm sure, that hunter-gatherers use, or people nowadays even that are surviving in the jungles, that they probably have techniques that we still don't know about, that we just don't understand because of either we haven't been exposed to it, or maybe there's a lack of understanding within, you know, translation of languages and such. You know, there's all sorts of different reasons why that might happen, I think.
Yeah. Sometimes they come up with some really clever ways of doing things that are very simple. You only need very primitive tools. But who knows?
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping when they dig up some of the other sites, they find some sort of record, something that's been preserved that gives us some clues to, you know, who built these things. It's so interesting.
Oh, yeah.
But we know nothing about them.
What would it be like to be able to actually talk to one of these people that either built the site or worked the site? I mean, we don't know what exactly that site was. It appears it had something to do with religion or shamanic tradition possibly. But man, what were these people like, you know? I mean, who knows if whatever language that they spoke, I mean, would we even be able to come close to even understanding it? And there's plenty of ancient languages that we know of. We have the text that we're still not able to decipher, you know?
Yeah. Speaking of, this isn't really ancient, but I want to do an episode. Have you heard of the Von Neuysch manuscript? That thing is weird.
I don't believe I'm familiar with that, no.
Oh, it's this book that they found. They think it was written like in 1400 or something, but nobody can translate it.
No, is that the one where the fella had like different drawings of flora and animals that like made absolute no sense? Like there was chimeras depicted and
yeah, I think so.
Different I don't even know the right word. I'm not going to try to pronounce that word that I was about to try to spit out because I don't think I can.
Is it anthropomorphic?
That's
is that what you're thinking of?
That's the one right there. That's the ticket.
All right. So some people think that actually at Gobekli Tepe that the central stones are supposed to depict people because they have like some of them have loincloths and arms carved into them. Some of them are just blank. So there's different speculations on that. Like, are they depicting gods, or are they depicting great warriors or leaders? Nobody really knows for sure, but they definitely look like they're depicting humanoid figures.
I agree. Yeah, they have hands clasped in the front. Is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then some of them also have what looks like belts or like loincloths in the front. Is that what it was? Like in the front of it, it has like a piece that looks like it's like possibly could have been a loincloth or something.
Yeah, belts and loincloths on some of them. What's interesting also is that the hands are clasped. It looks a lot like the Easter Island. What do you call those statues? They're the things from that that video game from the 80s. What was that? Life Force, I think it was called.
But yeah, those Easter Island statues are extremely interesting, man. Because have you ever seen the? You can go up on like Google Images and look up pictures of those statues that have been dug out down to their base, and it appears that like the dirt that's around it is all sedimented layers. It's not fill material or anything. It's all built up over thousands of years, and the amount of sedimented layers that has been built up over a lot of these giant statues are substantial. I mean, it's some of these sedimentary layers are over 6 feet deep.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these pictures that you see on the internet, these people are standing in these trenches around the statue that they've dug, and it's much taller than them. I mean, a lot of them are on a slope, so it could be a little misleading, I think, just because of the angle of the photo. But still, it's still a good little reference to see how much sedimentary dirt has been built up over those things. And I think it's very interesting because I think I do agree with the notion that those statues have bearded men depicted on them. So it looks like it's quite possible with the chin features. Those are big protruding chins, and it doesn't make sense that the chins would be the jawline would be that large and defined,
Mm-hmm.
And some of them seem to have features on their jawlines that look like it could be depicting a beard. And it's interesting because you also see similar depictions in places like Peru and Brazil, and even in the Aztec culture. Characters like Viracocha or Quetzalcoatl, those guys were both described as bearded individuals that brought civilization back after a great catastrophe. One thing that's also depicted in some of those civilizations is what appears to be a handbag. It also looks like there might be one of these handbags on some of the T-shaped pillars in Gobekli Tepe too. It could be just a coincidence, could be, but they're very similar shapes, and they look damn near exact.
At some point, you get so many coincidences, you have to start wondering.
Yeah. Well, and there's also similar geometric shapes that you find in a lot of megalithic structures, even like in India. In a lot of these cultures that have been around that has survived many, many thousands of years without great interruption, we'll say, you see a lot of these geometric patterns, even on like designs and houses on their tiles and stuff like that. A lot of these are representing sound frequency and resonance, what we would call the study of somatics. I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing a lot of these patterns that you could see in the study of somatics. When you have like a medium and you have like say sand on top of it, you have somebody that sings a specific song that has certain notes that it hits, that it actually makes these recognizable shapes, shapes that we've seen throughout religion, perhaps.
Well, and also you're reminding me of Chichen Itza or whatever. That's
is that in Peru?
Yeah, that pyramids there basically. And there's if you stand in like a specific place between the pyramids, supposedly if you make what was like a clapping or something, it sounds like one of their local birds. So
really?
whoever built it definitely had some knowledge of acoustics, like advanced knowledge. I forget the details though. I have to look that one up.
Yeah, but at the very least, it's there's a possible link there between different cultures that are separated in great distances in geography at the very least. But I think there's some, like we were talking about before, these characters in a lot of different religions or cultures, ancient cultures in particular, that these figures that are civilization bringing deities after a great catastrophe. I don't think that's a coincidence, because there's so many different similarities between the events that happen in these stories. A great catastrophe, somebody who was made aware of it before it happened, whether that have been through technology or godly intervention.
Yeah,
they were made aware of it. And we've heard people like say for instance Graham Hancock or Randall Carlson, some of these popular figures nowadays that talk about ancient human history and the possibilities of what we might be missing. I agree fully with the notion that we are a civilization with amnesia. I think it makes sense, because the scenario that's been presented many times before is if we were hit by a great catastrophe right now, a meteor impact or something like that, you and I wouldn't survive. We're we're way too reliant on technology, and everything as far as skills based out through our civilization, everything's too modular. Nobody has a great wealth of knowledge. At least very few people know how to do everything, especially when it comes to survival.
It's everything we have is so specific. Like, let's just give an example. Last week I put in new ignition coils in one of my cars. And the ignition coils, even if you understood the way it worked, way the electronics worked in those coils, you still wouldn't understand how to make the plastic that they're made of.
Oh yeah.
You know, or how to make the car that they go into, or I mean, the engine, the people who make the engine block and the people who make the ignition coils don't even know what the other person knows. You know what I mean? It's very specific knowledge. So if there was some sort of catastrophe and we lost all of our technology, I mean, you might know how to make that particular plastic, but you wouldn't know how to make the machine that molds it. So even if you did have some sort of specific knowledge, you would be kind of useless without the other people that you normally would work with to utilize that knowledge. I mean, if there was a catastrophe, it would set us back to the Stone Age, probably, more or less.
But then again, what is a Stone Age? Is a Stone Age that we think of as a Stone Age, was that actually the Stone Age, or is there a lot that we're missing? You know, because the sites like Gobekli Tepe, I mean, you have to start asking some questions. You know, were we actually hunter gatherers for all this period, or was there a segment of the human race that was actually advanced? You know, because it appears there definitely was.
Yeah. One of the really interesting things about Gobekli Tepe is that whoever built it or whoever was using the site backfilled it at some point. They buried it. This is probably the only reason why we have any record of it at all. Imagine how worn Stonehenge looks. Well, Stonehenge is 6,000 years ago. This is 6,000 years before Stonehenge. So if it hadn't been backfilled, the whole thing would probably just be dust, you know, or rocks that we wouldn't even really recognize as something that once belonged to a monolith. Apparently, the way they know that it was backfilled, because immediately, like I have like this inner skeptic, and I'm like, oh yeah, well, how do they know it was backfilled, huh? But it turns out when it's backfilled, the whole thing is covered in, you know, homogeneous material, basically. But if it had been buried by the time, then there would be layers of sediment. And it's apparently very obvious to archaeologists, so I can't be skeptical on that one.
Yeah, well, maybe if I was an archaeologist, I'd know exactly what that looks like. I've seen depictions of it on pictures and stuff. You know, the stereotypical history book type stuff where, you know, it gives you an example of a sedimentary layer.
Yeah.
But it's pretty amazing, though, because they started... So correct me if I'm wrong, but the entire hill is a man-made hill. Is that correct?
Yeah, so what happened, from what I could find, is that they used one site, and then they buried it, and then they built another site or circle next to or on top of the old one. And over time, that's what made the hill. The entire hill is man-made, apparently. And this is what Klaus Schmidt was able to identify immediately when he saw it. But I mean, that kind of blew my mind, because just look at a hill and be like, oh, that hill is man-made, when everybody else who's been there didn't recognize that, is pretty impressive.
Yeah, he must have some kind of a skill of reading the geography around him and identifying that as not being in place or not being natural. But I wonder how much... so that must have been a whole heap of material that was backfilled into that to cover the entire area.
Yeah, I actually looked that up, and I had to do some calculations because nobody actually said, but I found how much they think it took to backfill like one site, and then I multiplied it over. An estimate I found was that it took 13,000 cubic yards of material to backfill the entire 22-acre site. And just to convert some numbers, that's about 350,000 cubic feet, or equivalent to 2,620,000 gallons. I wasn't too familiar with a cubic yard. That's about a ton, or 2,000 pounds for 1 cubic yard. And then if you have rocky materials, so the fill at Gobekli Tepe was not just straight up dirt, it was kind of like rocky fill. That weighs as much as like 1.3 tons per cubic yard. Moving that much material would probably take one adult in really good shape, would take 1 or 2 days minimum to move that across like a football field or something. So wherever they got that fill from, it's so much fill.
Yeah. Well, and dirt like that, and I happen to know from recent experience, because of where I live, I'm running electrical out to my garage. I had to dig a 18-inch deep ditch out there, right? I know from experience because there's a lot of those what we call potatoes out here. Those rocks all over the dang dirt. You go 1 inch with your shovel and it stops you dead in your track. That stuff is not easy to deal with. There's no doubt about that. It's frustrating, you know.
I didn't see a whole lot of discussion about the backfilling, but I was really curious about that. Where did they get that material? How did they dig it up? How did they move it? And how did they put it over the pillars without disturbing things too much? Like that is actually an accomplishment to me anyways, just as significant as building the thing in the first place.
Well, and also it also would suggest a level of care that was taken with the site too, with covering it up. Because if it was filled in by, let's say, like a flood or a landslide or something crazy like that, right? It would probably destroy pretty much everything there, especially the pillars. Those pillars for certain wouldn't be standing up anymore. You know, and some of them, most of them, from what I understand, were found pretty much standing up, being held up by the dirt and fill material around them, but still standing up.
Yeah.
From what we understand, humans have had their current form, physical form, for about 200,000 years, maybe even more. Throughout that whole time, you'd think that if we are as capable right now as we are, if we had the same exact form, especially if our minds are capable of the same functions, you'd think that it's quite possible we could have gone through different incarnations, potentially, that we've reached heights before in society and we've had to start again because of a catastrophe, or maybe even a catastrophe that was caused by us ourselves.
Yeah, I heard that number, or I read that number somewhere, and I thought, what were we doing for 195,000 years? You know, like we just kind of just putzing around. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense that civilization just spontaneously sprung up out of nowhere a few thousand years ago, and then before then, people who were apparently the exact same as us were doing pretty much nothing. I don't know. It's weird.
Well, I mean, the human race has definitely been able to move leaps and bounds ahead in technological advancement. I mean, the Industrial Revolution is a perfect example of that. How many years did it take us to advance from horse and buggy cars to, you know, airplanes? That was within about a 50 year period, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty damn amazing. Who's to say that hasn't happened before, and just the evidence has been ground up into a fine pulp by the millennia, you know?
That's the thing. Like, if you look at our modern history we have pretty solid knowledge. Let's just say, roughly speaking, going back 4,000 years. So if you had a 4,000 year period, and then you had some sort of catastrophe, and then it might take 50,000 years for every single last trace of that to be wiped off the face of the planet, we could have a civilization like today that could have come and gone several times already in the history of mankind. There probably would be some sort of trace. Like, I don't think they had space shuttles and stuff necessarily, but it's hard for me to believe that there was not a lost civilization earlier than we think there was.
So I think we should probably talk more about some other milestones in human history that we do know about, to give this a little bit more perspective and give people a good idea of exactly how old this is. Because we could say, you know, the site is, you know, theorized to be 12,000 years old or 11,600 years old, depending on who you're talking to. But I mean, what does that exactly mean as far as actual events in history that people are very familiar with? And, you know, how does that line up as far as the age or whatever, the distance from us to certain events, or the distance from us in time from here to Gobekli Tepe, you know?
Right. And when I started looking some of this stuff up, it was kind of strange because on one hand, they say that Gobekli Tepe was unequivocally built by spear chuckers. But then I started finding some interesting things, like apparently art and religion and language started 40 to 70,000 years ago, as far as archaeologists can tell. Which, okay, so they had religion and art and language 70,000 years ago. And again, they just sort of, you know, just kind of killed some rabbits and stuff. They didn't really do anything with it. It's just hard to believe that they didn't develop anything more sophisticated in that time.
Of course, all they ever did with it was just use it to, you know, make paintings on caves and stuff, right?
Yeah, paint little stick figures on caves. Yeah, that's it. They painted stick figures for about 190,000 years. And then somebody had this great idea. Oh, maybe if we
hey guys, I think it's about time to start this civilization I've been hearing about there.
Yeah.
You know? I think I'm tired of this whole hunter-gatherer phase.
One of the things I read is they date that using genetics and stuff with crops and with animals that were bred specifically. But, my thinking is, how do they know that wild animals were not kept sort of like we keep farm animals and they just didn't breed them until later into because I don't know the specifics of it too much, but apparently like, the pigs we use and all this other stuff, those are not exactly the same as what the wild animals were.
Yeah.
So, the wild animals had to be bred and domesticated. But how do we know they were just domesticating wild animals? They had a bunch of gazelles in a pen somewhere, and they just fed them and then slaughtered them. But I mean, that could have been going on for a really long time. We just don't know about it. That's one of the major topics of discussion for this is how would they have built something like this without a more advanced social structure? So somebody had to feed all these people. Somebody had to motivate them. Hunter-gatherers, from what I understand, spent most of their time hunting and gathering. They didn't have any extra time for building stuff or for religion or all that other stuff. They were just trying not to starve to death, basically. So who could organize what would take hundreds and hundreds of people? Who would organize all these people? I mean, that's a social structure. It's not just like, a chief who's in charge. Somebody had to be like the architect. Somebody had to come up with the designs. Somebody had to translate these designs to the workers. They had to organize getting the stuff from the quarry to the site. I mean, all this stuff is, when you stop and think about it, is actually fairly complicated. Hunters and gatherers just didn't have that sort of thing going on for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that kind of annoys me sometimes, I guess I shouldn't let it get to me, but some of the assumptions that are made by mainstream archaeology or mainstream academia in general, I guess, they assume that the earliest site, when they find one of these sites, of course, they say this is where everything started, This is where everything was developed because this is the earliest example, so must have been where it was all made up,
Right.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, at least. And of course, I'm not an archaeologist. I didn't go to college for that kind of stuff. So maybe there's stuff that they know, a perspective perhaps that I'm not privy to. I'm certainly willing to accept that. But you look at the human race right now. Are we all one type of settled people?
Yeah.
Are we all the same sophistication? No. There's first world countries. There's second, third. There's hunter gatherers that still live in some of these jungles and forests around the world. There's no reason to think it should be any different at any other point in time,
right.
unless perhaps we at one point in time reached a sophistication level where the whole world was connected as one group of people, I guess. But why wouldn't there be different levels of sophisticated peoples throughout the earth, at any given point?
I think the main reason for that is that a lot of these archaeologists, well, pretty much all of them, they exist in like academia, and I think that they might speculate on these things, when they're standing around the water cooler, if that's what they do. But I don't think they can publish like research papers saying that there was an ancient civilization without actually having evidence of that civilization, because it could cost them their careers, I suspect. I don't know if that's true. If there's any archaeologists out there and you can comment on why we don't have more speculations, but I think that they only want to say stuff about, like they found some pottery shards and that's what they want to talk about. They don't want to speculate about who made the pottery shards unless they can find out a specific document or another artifact that will give them information about that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I agree fully that you need to be careful about what you accept as fact, and there needs to be substantial proof, especially if it's something as significant as a site like this.
Right.
If it takes human civilization from what we accept to be a 6,000-year-old period to 11,000 or 12,000 years, and maybe even farther than that, just because of the implications that may arise from this site.
Yeah.
I have no problem with people scrutinizing that information and making sure it's solid. That's what we should do, But I think there is also a fair amount of let's say a historian perspective, perhaps, where these archaeologists, they in their mind that they know these facts, and how dare you say that I'm wrong?
Right.
And I guess I could understand that, especially if somebody's, staked their career on a specific find or a perspective, on human civilization that they think that they've proven, and it turns out, well, no, you're completely wrong.
Right.
Yeah, they're not going to feel happy about that, and I don't necessarily blame them, but I think sometimes you just need to swallow your pride for the greater cause,
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the Younger Dryas. There's really interesting theories about what caused and stopped this. It's a strange period because geologically speaking, it started, there was an ice age, and the ice age was warming up, and then suddenly about 12,000, 13,000 years ago, just all of a sudden it happened, in the blink of an eye, it got really cold again for about 1,000 years or 1,200 years, and then it warmed up again. But both events, getting colder again and getting warmer again, happened in such a short period that they're not even really sure. I was reading one article about it that said it could have happened overnight for all they know. That's how, but they estimate it happened in about 10 years, which for geological times.
It's described as a mini ice age, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it was as cold and as intense as some of the most coldest parts of the last ice age that lasted much, much longer, right?
Right. And one of the interesting things, too, is that there's really no scientific consensus for what caused it to start and stop. Usually for these things, there's some sort of really good evidence, and they're pretty sure what caused whatever. But for this one, there's a couple of competing theories. Some people think that it could have been a comet explosion in the atmosphere that started it. And, if it burned a lot of forests and there was a lot of debris in the atmosphere, that would have blocked the sun and made everything cold, and that could have started it. Or a comet impacting somewhere in the ocean, spitting up a bunch of magma, and there would have been hot rain all over the planet or whatever, that could have heated things up again. I didn't want to go too much into detail with those theories, but for each one of these theories, there's somebody else, like an actual science. These are all scientific stuff. There's another scientist who says, yeah, that's okay, but it doesn't really make sense because of, X, Y, and Z. And then they point out good counter arguments to that stuff. One of the interesting finds was that there's two possible craters under Greenland that could explain this, but they're hard to examine because they're under quite a lot of ice, a ton of ice.
Yeah.
So they can't really get down there and, look at the rocks and find the meteorites or whatever they are.
Yeah. But correct me if I'm wrong, but through geological surveys, they found the depressions, or what they believe is the depressions of those impacts, correct?
Right, but there are some scientists who dispute that those are impact craters. Some people say, well, those aren't actually impact craters. It's, this, that, or the other. But then the other scientists will come back and say, they are impact craters, but the glacier has been grinding away at it, and that's why it doesn't look normal.
Yeah, so naturally it would look different than it originally did. Yeah.
But a lot of what I read on that, to be honest, was a little bit above my head, so I can't say entirely.
Yeah, some of that stuff, I've read some about so supposedly, I guess there's evidence that they found in some of the segmented layers of when this occurred. I guess they're called proxy impact points. They find stuff like nanodiamonds and certain spherical molecules, I guess, that are only able to be created under certain circumstances, very high pressure, high temperature situations. Those are, telltale markers, I guess, of comet impacts, or at least a significant event nonetheless.
Yeah. But even that, I was reading about that kind of stuff, and I found some other articles that were saying, oh, this person from this university or whoever, I figured all the details, like they tested for that stuff, and they found problems with the original testing, and they said that, they didn't find as much as was reported, or the dating on the ice cores was incorrect, and just, so, I didn't want to get too bogged down in researching the Younger Dryas, because it's sort of off the point, but everything I found about the Younger Dryas, there was some sort of controversy. Like there was no consensus for any of this stuff, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, that they still haven't really figured it out to where everybody agrees what the causes were. So that I kind of like that. It's sort of a mystery.
Well, I think it's some of it at least is part of a healthy process of making sure the information is fact, or at least we can look at it as much a fact as we can with confidence, you know?
Yeah, for sure. One of the wildest theories, at least to me, is this guy named Robert Schoch, I think his name is, Schoch. And this sounds like kind of an out there theory to me, but this guy apparently has a PhD from Yale, so he's not a dummy.
Yeah.
Probably.
They're not just handing those things out.
Yeah. So he thinks that there was a massive solar activity that ended the Younger Dryas, a coronal mass ejection. And the way he describes it is that this would have been such a massive event. It wouldn't be like a normal solar flare that we have. It would have been like a solar flare that reached out and got the planet, basically. It enveloped the whole planet. And it would have caused like plasma events. And the way he said it was, it would have been like instead of rain, it would have been lightning. It would have been raining lightning to such an extent that it would have killed pretty much everything on the surface of the planet, with the exception of things that were hiding in caves or something like that. So animals, people, whatever, it just would have wiped out everything.
Man, use your imagination. What the heck would that have been like? It's like, how the hell does anything survive something like that? If that's a reality, you know?
I know, it's pretty wild.
I mean, it boggles the mind, right? Even just to try to think of the totality of what that could even be, you know?
But
and I'm sure our imaginations probably can't even begin to do it justice, you know?
Right. It's really interesting though, because this theory, it does have some actual, I don't know if I don't want to say proof or anything, but there is some stuff backing it up. So for example, it would match very well how quickly the Younger Dryas ended. Like it would be a perfect match for the end of this period. It would be a perfect match for Gobekli Tepe because it would explain where whoever built this thing, where they went. Because it looks like when they look at it, like the newer structures in Gobekli Tepe don't look as sophisticated as the older structures. So it's almost like somebody found the older ones and then tried to build something like it, but couldn't do it as good. So it could explain things like that too.
And I think I remember some time ago you mentioning that there's pictographs found worldwide that may actually like be referencing these coronal mass ejections.
Yeah, so I remember reading about this or hearing about this somewhere, and I thought it was complete BS. But then I went to Schoch's website and I was reading stuff on there, and he's got side-by-side comparisons of petroglyphs and certain types of plasma from, the petroglyphs from around the world and certain types of plasma that you might find. And they look pretty much exactly the same. It's actually shocking.
That's what we did there.
There's certain petroglyphs like birdmen and circles and rings, things like that, that look so much like the plasma events that I just couldn't believe it. At first, when I read about it, it sounded like it was complete nonsense. Humanoid figures from lightning strikes, like that's BS. Well, that doesn't make any sense. No, it sounds exactly like it.
And, especially something that odd too. I mean, it kind of makes the chance of a coincidence being less likely just because of how unique the event itself is,
Right. And you have figures around the world with, humanoids with bird heads, and you have some of these objects or petroglyphs are similar between civilizations that should not have had any contact with each other, on different sides of the planet kind of a thing. So it's a really kind of interesting theory. There's not really any proof there, but it does sort of back up that this plasma event might have happened.
I mean, it's much more simpler to think of like a meteor impact, I guess. We could, relate to that easier.
Yeah, it's a little harder to wrap your head around a plasma event that nobody in recorded history has witnessed. It's so rare that we could only speculate that it might happen. I think it's easier to wrap your head around stuff that we have recorded histories of, or something like an impact where you can go to the impact crater and, go for a swim or something. It's a lot more obvious.
Like a lot of these sites that we find around the world too. It's interesting how much like erosion are on some of them. It was a Robert Schoch, and the reason why I'm saying this is because you were talking about Robert Schoch. Was he one of the people? I think I heard him on I think it was a Joe Rogan podcast or something, talking about the erosion of like the Sphinx enclosure and how it's precipitous erosion and not flood erosion.
Yeah, that's where I first heard of this guy, was on the JRE. Is a really good episode. If you haven't heard it, go check it out.
Hmm.
He started with his I don't know, offbeat theories with the Sphinx, I think. And yeah, it's supposed to be, he thinks it's dated around the time of Gobekli Tepe,
Hmm.
which is interesting because nobody back then should have been able to build a Sphinx either. That's
Hmm.
about as ridiculous as them building Gobekli Tepe. You know,
Yeah.
they're both, neither one should be built by hunter-gatherer societies.
Yeah. Well, but the Sphinx itself doesn't make any sense because when it was supposed to have been built, there's evidence of restoration bricks from that very time period on the Sphinx, still today. So, like, I know I've heard a couple people state this exact question. Why would they need to restore a structure that should have been brand new or at least relatively new?
That's a really interesting one. I didn't know about that. So what you're saying is it could be much, much older than even Gobekli Tepe.
In the front, in between the Sphinx paws, there's supposed to be a plaque. I guess it's not all there anymore. Some of it has deteriorated since the plaque was found. But the reason why the construction of the Sphinx was attributed to the pharaoh Khufu was because there was one single syllable, Khu. Was it Khu?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Right. But it didn't have. But from what I understand, and maybe I'm remembering this incorrectly, but from what I understand, there wasn't a cartouche around that, so it shouldn't have any like royal significance as far as it shouldn't have been something that was stated by a pharaoh, or it shouldn't have been referencing a pharaoh specifically.
Wasn't there something similar for the Great Pyramids too? Like they say it was built by Khufu, but all they found was basically some graffiti that didn't really match up.
Well, but that graffiti is very interesting though because it appears that graffiti, or maybe it was a marking of some sort. It appears to be some kind of a red paint. I've seen a picture of it before. It looks like a kind of cartouche, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And part of it goes like under, like in between two blocks.
Hmm.
So it looks like that was painted before that block was laid in place.
Hmm.
I mean, it appears, but it also, supposedly the story of the archaeologist that found it, I guess there was some shenanigans that had happened. People that went up there before didn't see it, and he went up there by himself, and somehow he found it. It was there after he was there, but it wasn't supposedly before.
Really?
I don't know if that's just bull crap, it's just made up or not, but I remember that specific scenario being stated when I learned about that story.
Interesting. I don't think I've heard that one before.
Yeah, that's possible. I could have made that up on the spot too.
Yeah, why not? What the hell? But there's a lot of these civilizations that we know of have myths of like massive flooding. So for example, the myth of Atlantis has this massive flooding, but they also have similar stories of an ancient civilization that was more advanced being wiped out. Egyptians, for example, have something that they call Zep Tepi, which is the first time, and it's like a golden age of civilization. The myth doesn't really have any dates or anything, but it's very similar to the Atlantis myth, which Plato did give some dating to, that is similar to, or it's in the ballpark of when Gobekli Tepe was around. I don't think that they can line them up exactly, but it's pretty close.
Mm-hmm. And supposedly, from what I understand too, Plato's knowledge was supposed to have came from the Library of Alexandria. So his knowledge dated supposedly from the Egyptians.
Interesting. I didn't hear that.
Supposedly, from what I remember, Plato, his stories of Atlantis was passed on from, was it Solon or Sauron? Damn, I always get confused because of freaking the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that sounds familiar.
Yeah, I know, right? And every time, inevitably that I try to remember which one of those names it is, I'm sure I'll say the wrong one, but it's one. He was a philosopher as well, and he was related to Plato. I believe he was his grandfather, I think, or great grandfather, something like that. It'd probably be something that would be important to look up for factual accuracy.
Who needs factual accuracy?
Yeah, it's a bunch of shenanigans if you ask me. Fake news, right? But yeah, I think it's amazing that that information supposedly came from the Library of Alexandria. I just imagine what information did we lose, man, when that library was destroyed.
Yeah. You know what really bugs me too is how you have all these people in the Middle East today, like these terrorists who want to destroy these ancient sites that, I mean,
Hmm.
a lot of them are like Muslim sites, but I'm not Muslim, but it's just really sad that these really buildings thousands of years, well, I don't know about thousands, but really old, however old they are, and they're just getting trashed. It's just really sad.
Well, and the significance of a lot of these sites too, it's human history. It's not just the history because it's so important to human the way we have developed in influencing where we are today. I'm sure has who knows how much influence. It's substantial. It's human history. It's you got to respect that. I mean that to me that's a whole nother level of importance where it doesn't matter about your country because I mean that realm, that area of the world has had people on it for as long as there's been people, presumably, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not always been the same ideal system that's been there, but there's always been great people in that region, powerful civilizations, very important. And one of the things I think that I'm not sure if we touched on this or not, but when Gobekli Tepe was filled in, or when it was built, because we don't know when it was built, but that area was very, very different than the area that we know now. There's a lot of desert region. There's not a lot of agriculture and stuff there because of temperatures and because of how dry it can be.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not all desert, but it's not known for its agriculture.
Right.
I was gonna say, supposedly back then it was a much more lush environment, much more temperate temperatures. At any rate, it was a much more hospitable climate.
Yeah. Some people think that it might be the origin of the Garden of Eden story.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. It could have been.
Just to end up our talk about the Younger Dryas, it kind of ties in to all these flood stories because whatever ended it would have melted all these glaciers covering a lot of North America and caused these massive floods. So it's interesting because a lot of cultures talk about these floods, and the end of the Younger Dryas could be that event. And there seems to be some evidence that there was an advanced civilization that built Gobekli Tepe and possibly some other things around the world. So these stories might be referring to an actual real civilization that got wiped out and not just being a story. There is a sort of a precedent for this is the city of Troy, which they thought the city of Troy was just a story until they actually found it. And then they're, oh, well, this is actually real. So just because it's a myth doesn't mean that it wasn't based on anything that actually happened.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the stories of Plato used to find the city of Troy?
I don't remember the story. I read about it briefly, but I'm not 100% sure about that. You probably know more about it than I do.
Yeah, I don't remember the specifics off the top of my head, but I remember if I'm remembering correctly, and I know I've been saying that a lot, so I hope that doesn't take away from any credibility or lack thereof.
It's cool. Nobody thinks we're credible.
Oh yeah, I'm giving myself too much credit there, huh? So the archaeologists that found the city of Troy, from what I understand, basically took what Plato said and decided to follow it as fact. I guess that's what led him directly to the site of Troy.
I found a really cool quote by, well, I think it's cool. Probably nobody else does. But I found this quote from Robert Schoch that I think pretty much expresses his opinion. And it sounded nice, so I thought I'd just read it. He says, "In my assessment, there is now overwhelming evidence that sophisticated culture, civilization, existed prior to the end of the last ice age, and this is what gave rise to the story of Atlantis and similar legends, thus confirming Plato and other ancient traditions. However, this early cycle of civilization was dealt a mighty setback. It was utterly devastated, with only a few isolated remnants surviving, by the natural cataclysms that brought the last ice age to a close, circa 9700 BCE. So that's pretty much in a nutshell his whole thing. He has a lot of really cool articles on his website, and he has some books and stuff out there too. So I think it's definitely worth checking his stuff out. At least check out his website because it's not the most mainstream of theories, but
Yeah.
this he's not a dummy either.
He's very detail oriented. That
Yeah.
guy is an intelligent individual, and he does his due diligence also as far as his research. There's no doubt
Right.
about that. And you can tell by just the level of explanation he's able to give.
Yeah.
I mean, all these T-shaped pillars is a bunch of carvings and symbols, and there's a lot of people that have theorized what do some of these things mean. And there's a lot of different stuff that's on there. They have all sorts of different animals being depicted. You got vultures, they got scorpions, they got, humanoid figures. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, well, I read that the creatures depicted, like they have scorpions and vultures and stuff like that. It's unusual for what you might expect for something like this. I don't know, I'm not an archaeologist, but from what I read, most of the time they don't have these sorts of animals on there.
Yeah, and yeah, some of those depictions are very unique. One of them is a humanoid. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it the humans being held by like a vulture? Is that right?
Well, so it's a picture of like a vulture, and the vulture has his wings outstretched, and it has an orb or a circle over the wing, and that is, a lot of people interpret that to be the head of, there's a figure beneath the bird that looks like a decapitated humanoid, or like a humanoid without a head. But for me, it's hard to make that interpretation because, first of all, the vulture looks sort of humanoid, almost like a guy wearing a costume, which is another theory that I read. But the humanoid figure at the bottom is like really small compared to the vulture. And you'd think if it was some sort of human sacrifice, or if that was his head, I think he would be a little more prominently figured, he or she, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But it's sort of, he's almost like he's at the very bottom and he's out of the way, almost like he's not even important. So it might be his head, it might not be his head. It's hard for me to say one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, because that shape that the vulture is holding that could possibly be the head is worn away quite a bit, right? That's one of the reasons why it's hard to tell exactly what it could be.
I don't know. I didn't see anything about how worn it was, but from what I could tell and what I read, it's just a circle. It doesn't have really any extra stuff on it beside like a face or eyeballs or anything. And it's not skull shaped or anything either, or head shaped. It's just a circle.
Yeah.
So
In particular, yeah.
So it could be literally anything.
Yeah. And that's the one that's on Pillar 43.
Yeah, they call it Pillar 43 for anybody who wants to Google it.
Yeah, you can look at those pictures. They're readily available. They're pretty easy to find.
Yeah, this is, if you Google Gobekli Tepe, this is usually the first pillar that comes up. The pictures come up right away for this one.
Mm-hmm.
And
is that the same one that has like the belt on it with the loincloth, and it's the pillar itself is supposedly depicting like a humanoid form?
I don't remember if this one had a belt or not. That's because not all of them have the belt or the arms.
Yeah, some of them are even blank, right?
Yeah, some of them are just blank. But one theory is that this is evidence of a skull cult or a death cult, because some people found fragments of skulls that looked like they were the meat had been taken off of the skull, and the skulls had been painted and carved, and even a hole drilled through one of them, so maybe it was like hung up as a decoration.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem I found with that particular theory is that these skulls are dated like 3,000 years later or something. So if it was a skull cult, they would have been doing this the whole time, right? It wouldn't have just been 3 skulls. So they found hundreds of skull fragments, human skull fragments, but only 3 of the skulls had any sort of carving. So it's interesting, it's possible, but it's not really conclusive. So it's hard to say that that's what's depicted on that pillar.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to find out exactly what the truth of that matter is. Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of people that think that these animals could be, a representation of, different constellations in the sky that these people might have been depicting.
Right, and I think that's probably the most plausible explanation for these carvings, or at least a lot of them, because a lot of the carvings are, like, let's say the scorpion could be Scorpio, and they may not have called it that, but a lot of cultures around the world identified that constellation with a scorpion. So there's even, cultures that didn't know each other. A lot of them identified Orion as a hunter, for example. So there's evidence that might be, I mean, it's not like hard evidence, but there is, it is really plausible to me anyways that these could be constellations.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's been plenty of cultures that we can reference that uses animals, animals and humanoid figures, even chimera. Is chimera the term where it's like half animal, half human?
Yeah, I think so. At least on FMA it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Shout out to FMA. Yeah. I mean, there's a long tradition of animals and human figures being used as representation of constellations, to, connecting the stars to form shapes and figures. And why should it be any different here?
Yeah, and one interesting theory I read about that was that so the vulture was seen sort of as like a grim reaper or a creature that carried the soul off because it ate dead flesh, like it would get some dead flesh in its mouth and then fly away. So some cultures apparently saw the vulture as taking the person's soul into the heavens. So they might have done as part of a funeral, they might have actually just put the body out and let the vultures get it and fly away with pieces of the person. I'm trying not to be too gross here.
Yeah.
And apparently also the circle was often used to represent a soul in certain other cultures. So there's one theory that the vulture is somebody dressed as a vulture and the circle's representing a soul. And what the depiction on Pillar 43 is sort of like a funeral where the person's soul is being carried off. But again, it's all just completely speculative. There's really no way to prove any of this. There's no evidence at all. It's just somebody looks at the pictures and says, well, it could be this or it could be that, but we don't know for sure.
Well, it's got to be something.
Yeah, it could be. Well, who knows? I mean, it's really interesting.
What would it be like to talk to some of these people? You'll have a time machine and go back.
Oh, see, it's people like you are going to screw up the timeline, man.
Yeah, you're right. I know, right? This curiosity didn't just kill a cat, killed the whole human race.
I heard an interesting theory once that somebody said, we know that people will never invent time machines because if they do, we would have already met them. They would have come back and we would have met them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which is an interesting theory. So the pillars themselves, there's really good evidence that they were oriented towards a constellation. And so the whole thing was basically a primitive observatory. So, and the evidence for this is when they built new pillars, but the central pillars, or that when they built new circles, the central pillars pointed in slightly different directions. So this could match along with, the precession. So the Earth has a wobble and the constellations are not always in the same place. It changes over time. So one idea is that Orion was the constellation they were looking at here. But when you there's actually software now that is really cool. You can put in a date, 150,000 years ago, and it'll show you what the night sky would have looked like back then, where Orion would have been and where everything would have been.
Where the constellations are oriented. Like if you were, I think I know which one you're talking about. I think I've seen a video of that.
Yeah.
You can pick like a place on Earth and basically figure out, like, turn the time table back there, turn the clock back as it was.
Right.
And then figure out exactly what it looked like.
It's relatively easy to research this kind of stuff nowadays. From what I found, when you compare the dating of the sites with where Orion would have been when they were built, it doesn't really line up with Orion. But Deneb, which is a star in the Cygnus constellation, does line up. It's not 100% because the carbon dating, from what I understand, is not 100%. But it's the closest match that I could find. Yeah, and the idea is that when Deneb changed location enough in the sky, they had to build a new monument so that they could have it centered on Deneb again, and then they filled in the old one, and that would explain, why they would they would spend so much energy building something like this, and then just fill it in.
Adjust for precession.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. The precession of the stars, I think it's called.
It makes some sense too, because say for instance, if you were trying to communicate a level of knowledge or understanding throughout the millennia or to people far in the future. And that's, you could say one form of a time machine in itself, right?
Right, yeah.
But, architecture would be one of the best ways to do it. Stone architecture, right?
Well, because, you could encode information, like when we sent out one of the Voyager crafts, we sent this information, and a lot of the information was just pictures. Like we sent a picture which was how to find Earth using neutron stars that were pointed towards us, pulsars.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But it didn't say that. It was just a picture. But that information was encoded in that picture, and we just assumed that somebody who was intelligent to find it would know what it meant. But maybe they don't. I mean, maybe it's the same thing here where they encoded information in there, but we just haven't figured out what that information is yet. One of the most controversial things about Gobekli Tepe is that it really challenges what we thought the timeline of mankind was, because there supposedly were hunters and gatherers, but the hunters and gatherers could not have built this thing. So that's basically what the contention is on this site and why it's interesting. I mean, it's not really a conspiracy or anything, but it just changes everything we know about human history, which makes it kind of a weird and strange topic for me.
Yeah, definitely turns back the dial on what we accepted. That's for sure. Agriculture, architecture, a lot of these type of things, even organized religion. I mean, the logic would suggest that the hunter-gatherers just wouldn't have enough free time. You know, you had to have stockpiles of supplies to have that much free time to create architecture like that.
Yeah.
Even to study the stars, you know.
Yeah.
Now, I think that who knows how long the limit of the age of Gobekli Tepe could be astronomical. It could be massive, you know, who knows? Because we just have a good beat on when it was supposedly filled in.
Right. Well, that, and they found tools at the site and some other stuff, but they can't actually carbon date the stone. So,
Yeah.
you know, for all we know, it could have been built 50,000 years ago, and then somebody else just found it and used the site. So anything's possible. There's really no way to know for sure, but we know for sure when people were there, but that doesn't tell us when it was built. It was definitely built before that, but how long ago, we don't really know.
If only we could carbon date stone or had some kind of method to date stone when it was quarried or what have you. The answers that would provide for us in megalithic structure study would be amazing. The story that we would be able to uncover about the human race.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I was actually, when I was researching this, I was thinking, compared to, like, let's say astronomy or other sciences, archaeology still seems somewhat crude. Like, I was reading about how they find exoplanets. They found a lot of them using the Doppler shift. So basically the gravity of the planet alters the light of the star it's circling. So wrap your head around that. The planet, let's say something the size of Earth compared to the size of the sun, 100 light years away, it causes such a subtle shift in the light that it's almost imperceivable, but somehow astronomers still use this to detect planets. It kind of blows my mind. But astronomers, they still have to use a shovel to dig stuff up. And if they find the subtle hint of something, it's just dust. It doesn't mean anything to them. So they're not able to detect these really subtle things like they can in other sciences yet. But hopefully that'll change. Yeah. I don't know how it would possibly change, but
yeah. Well, there's a lot of solid studying. That's a lot of solid work that's being done in archaeology, but it is a study that's based highly on opinion, and it leans on other sciences. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Like I said, there's a lot of good work that's being done, but I think there's a lot of assumptions that are made based on other false assumptions, I guess you'd say, right? I mean, like, for instance, whenever somebody finds a site like Gobekli Tepe, they always assume it was hunter-gatherers. You know, they never want to credit any kind of high society, any kind of sophisticated peoples, because, you know, that can't be possible, right? Because we're the end-all, be-all. We are the highest level of sophistication of the human race, right?
Right. Well, and it's not only that. Kind of what I was getting at too is that no matter how good the circumstantial evidence is, like Gobekli Tepe, I mean, come on, that's really good evidence right there. But until they find like explicit evidence of an ancient civilization, it's not even on the radar. You know what I mean? Which seems kind of strange that it's not even really being discussed that much. At least as far as I could find in academia. It's more on like guys like Graham Hancock, who makes good points, but let's face it, he's kind of on the fringe of things. And I don't think he's really taken seriously by, you know, most archaeologists.
Probably. I mean, but he's more and more he's being taken serious by, well, certainly by your everyday person, your average individual that is trying to absorb this kind of knowledge, because most people aren't going to be going to college for this type of stuff. They might be reading books. They might be reading books, but most likely they're going to be watching a podcast or lecture or something like that, you know. And that's the type of individual, Graham Hancock, that is all over that type of media. So, you know, there's plenty of people that are being influenced with that, and I think it's doing a great amount of good because it's opening up people's, you know, perceptions, just what they're willing to accept in general, you know.
Yeah.
Because most people, there's plenty of people out there that are just going to not want to listen to anything that's, you know, what they might call woo-woo, to use a word that Graham Hancock uses, you know, if I can.
Yeah.
If they think it's something that is just implausible, they're closed-minded to it. They're not going to even want to listen to anything they have to say. But little by little, people are opening up, you know, especially because, you know, internet, there's no doubt about that. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but there's a whole heap of beautiful information too that grants people great amounts of perspective.
Yeah,
you know?
for sure. It's hard to read some of these discussions, though. Some of them are really good. Some of them, as soon as anybody says anything, there's just all these people, these nasty people just pile in, and you can't have a discussion, man. It's get the trolls out of there. It's just, so what if something's a little out there? I think it's worth discussing, even if it doesn't necessarily hold up to scientific. You know what I mean? Like, you got to get the ideas, ideas churning.
I think there's a place. There's a place for trolling, though. I think there's a place for. There's no doubt about there's an abundance of toxic attitudes and comments, and there's a lot of unnecessary things being said. There's no doubt about that. But I do enjoy the witty troll, though, that is poking fun at something that is obviously ridiculous, whatever it may be.
Yeah,
you know?
No, I'm talking more about the kind of troll that's, you know, say you're talking about Gobekli Tepe, and then somebody says something on the site, and then basically somebody comes and says, no, that didn't happen. You know, those pillars aren't there. You're like, no, they're there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it like they're not witty trolls. They're just trying to wreck the conversation, and there's just so much of that. It's like, dude, go start your own forum thread. Quit messing up other people's.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that in realms like Egyptology.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of people that poo-poo on anything new or anything that flies in the face of what's accepted. And that's one of the things I think that frustrates me about some of these sites, especially like famous ones like Egypt, is you know, like Giza, the plateau, all those structures on there. There's supposedly tunnels. There's supposed ground penetrating radar that has been used to find, you know, cavities that are shaped like, you know, a square or rectangle that there's no doubt it had to have been made like by hands, by man hands, you know, by humans.
Yeah, and then they won't let them dig it up. They say, nope, you're not. Yeah, well, but you're not looking in there.
I remember hearing, I think it was Robert Schoch. I think it was him talking about it on a podcast, where they believe they witnessed them drilling down into a chamber that was found under the one of the paws of the Sphinx. I don't remember which paw it was, but they claimed that they were draining water or something like that. I wish I remember which claim they brought up to cover up what they were doing, but it seems like they were looking for something.
Yeah.
And who knows what the heck is down in there, you know? But I mean, why wouldn't you want to uncover as much as you could and learn everything you can about what's there? Because there's some amazing stuff. And I think another frustrating part about all those structures there is, like, in my opinion, I consider that world history, human history. It's not just the history of that country, you know, or even the people that are currently there. That's human history because it's so old and it's so substantial, you know?
Yeah, for sure. So there's one theory I read about. This archaeologist named Ted Banning from the University of Toronto suggests that there is evidence of daily habitation and suggests that many people were housed at the site, and that instead of a temple, maybe it was a communal home. So a lot of the people who argue that it was a temple say that because wild animals, a lot of the bones, they found just thousands of bones of wild animals there at the site, that if it had been domesticated animals, then people would have lived there, but because it was wild animals, then people must have traveled there. But he says that that's not necessarily the case. And I found this really interesting quote by him. What he says was, I'm going to mess this up probably, but here goes. The presupposition that art, or even monumental art, should be exclusively associated with specialized shrines or other non-domestic spaces also fails to withstand scrutiny. There's abundant ethnographic evidence for considerable investment in the decoration of domestic structures and spaces, whether to commemorate the feats of ancestors, advertise a lineage's history or a chief's generosity, or record initiations and other house-based rituals. So he's basically what he's saying is that, hey, just because there's art there doesn't mean that it was for religious purposes. In fact, we know of, countless types of art for, pretty much every period in history that we have good records for. There's a ton of art that's not for anything religious at all, just to decorate your house, basically. So he's suggesting...
Well, I have some in my house right now.
Yeah. So he's suggesting that this is just, house decorations for communal living, which I thought was a really interesting theory. But again, like everything else, it's pretty much pure speculation.
It'd be some pretty odd decorations, man. But to each their own, right? You never know.
Well, just think about it. Like, we have a picture of, Van Gogh's Starry Night. I think we have a reprint of that on our wall. I mean, if you didn't know anything about Western culture and you saw that, you might think it was kind of weird, So I think everything needs to be in context to be understood. One last theory that I've read about, or I saw this on Ancient Aliens. They had Gobekli Tepe and they try to tie it into the aliens. So aliens, no. I didn't see even a single hint of a shred of information suggesting the aliens were at all involved. I mean, I wish I could say that aliens helped us build this, but it'd be
quite a stretch, I think.
Yeah, it just seems like complete fiction to me. I don't know. What do you think?
The farthest stretch I think I might be able to make with something like that could possibly be maybe there's some knowledge that was passed on to people in this area and they were taught how to do some architecture, maybe they were hunter-gatherers, but they were provided with a level of knowledge that brought them out of that stage, perhaps.
But even so, I think it's more likely that would be from like an advanced civilization of people.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah. That's just me saying that.
Right.
I mean, there's absolutely nothing. I'm just, talking out my rear. Yeah, there's absolutely nothing I'm going off of. I'm just theorizing.
Yeah.
Just a big what if.
All right. So let's wrap it up. Do you have any final thoughts on Gobekli Tepe?
Well, I think for anybody who's interested in this realm of information, the big what if, how old is human civilization? What evidence is there out there? Because there's a lot of people that may say, hey, there's nothing out there really. Because I've talked to plenty of people. I enjoy asking people about these type of sites just to get a kind of a consensus of the people around me of what they know, because there's not, your average person isn't always going to be this interested in archaeology, most people that I asked about have never heard of this site. So there's no doubt that they don't know the implications of what it means for accepted human history and the timeline in particular, so when I do, at times do an okay enough job of describing this site to them, and when they do understand what I'm talking about, man, that you see their eyes light up, and once those gears start turning, they don't stop, I think this is one of the perfect sites to kind of indoctrinate somebody on this type of experience, this type of rabbit hole, if you were, because it's a very inspiring site, and the implications of what all this might mean, and the imagination when you run wild with how old could this really be, and man, I think it's something that could get a lot of people interested in archaeology and the possibility of ancient human history.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's such an interesting site. I wasn't expecting to read so much on it. I thought, just a couple of rocks, I'll read about it, write out a couple notes, whatever. But no, I fell into the rabbit hole for, several days, as you've seen from my many pages of notes. And it's just such a fascinating site. And so for me, what are the chances that we just so happen to find the oldest thing ever built by man? I don't know. I tend to think of things. I think there's a technical term for this. I forget what it is, but basically everything is average, on average. So if you go to the fair and you're playing pool games or throwing darts or whatever it is, you're going to be about average. There's going to be people better than you at the fair, people worse than you. And it's kind of like that no matter what you do. So if you find in ancient ruins, chances are that there's stuff that was built that's newer and stuff that was built that was older. I think there's a very good chance that this is not the oldest thing ever built, and we just haven't found it yet. So that's one of the most interesting things to me as well.
The oldest thing that was built probably ain't there anymore. It's probably been ground up into a pulp.
Right, exactly. And the only reason we have this is because it was backfilled. So who knows?
Absolutely.
But maybe there's something, like what was it, Pompeii or whatever, where the volcano covered everything in ash and preserved it. I mean, there could be something like that we haven't found yet. It is really interesting to me.
Yeah, we just haven't looked there yet because we haven't thought to.
Right, exactly. So I don't know. I really like this. I really like this site. Let's end the episode with a quote by Ian Hoddard, the director of Stanford's archaeology program. Many people think that it changes everything. It overturns the whole apple cart. All of our theories were wrong. All right. Thanks for listening. Tune in next time.